The howl of the wind carried the echoes of her sobs as Hannah Miller stood abandoned in the dust, watching her half-brother's wagon disappear over the horizon. 22 years of familial bonds had amounted to nothing more than being left with a dilapidated ranch and a mountain of debt in Julian, California, 1876. Her threadbare dress fluttered against her legs as the reality of her situation settled heavy on her shoulders like the gathering storm clouds above. Hannah wiped her tears with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her freckled cheek. 4 days ago, her father had been laid to rest beside her mother in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church. 4 days, and her half-brother Thomas had already sold everything of value, packed his belongings, and abandoned her with nothing but a property no one wanted and debts she couldn't hope to pay. "You'll figure it out," Thomas had said dismissively before climbing into his wagon. "Or marry someone who can. That face of yours ought to be good for something." The Miller ranch had once been prosperous, but 3 years of drought had withered their fortunes along with the land. Her father's illness had drained what little savings remained. Now, with Thomas gone, Hannah was completely alone. She turned back toward the weathered farmhouse, its paint peeling in the harsh California sun. The barn leaned precariously to one side, and the fence around the corral had more gaps than posts. She owned nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever Thomas had deemed not worth taking. Hannah was still standing there, numb with shock and grief, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her despair. She turned, shielding her eyes against the sun, to see a rider approaching from the direction of town. For a wild moment, she thought Thomas had returned, but as the figure drew closer, she recognized the broad shoulders and distinctive black hat of Blake Zimmerman, owner of the neighboring Double Z Ranch. Blake dismounted in one fluid motion, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the dirt yard. Hannah had known him most of her life, though only in passing. He was 30 years old, unmarried, and had a reputation for being fair but reserved. His ranch was the most successful in the county, having somehow weathered the drought that had destroyed so many others. "Miss Miller," he greeted her, removing his hat. His voice was deep, carrying the faint accent of his German ancestors. His eyes, the color of a summer sky, took in her tear-stained face. "I saw Thomas heading out of town with a loaded wagon, thought I should come check on things." Hannah swallowed her pride with difficulty. "He's gone, took everything of value and left me with the debts." Blake's expression darkened. "I'm sorry to hear that. Your father was a good man." "Yes, he was," Hannah said, her voice breaking slightly. She gestured toward the dilapidated house. "I don't know what I'm going to do. The bank will foreclose within the month." Blake was silent for a long moment, studying the property with a critical eye. Then he looked back at her, his gaze direct and unflinching. "I need help on my ranch," he said. "My housekeeper left 2 weeks ago to marry her sweetheart in San Francisco. I need someone to cook, clean, and help with the accounts." He shifted his weight, seeming almost uncomfortable. "I can offer you fair wages and a place to stay. It wouldn't be charity. I genuinely need the help." Hannah stared at him, stunned by the unexpected offer. She'd never worked for wages before, having only ever helped around her family's ranch. The prospect was both terrifying and strangely liberating. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," Blake replied simply. "Stay with me, at least until you figure out what you want to do next." Hannah looked back at the house where she'd grown up, where her mother had died giving birth to a stillborn brother, where her father had taken his last labored breath. There was nothing for her here now but memories and debt. "When would you want me to start?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Now, if you're willing," Blake said. Pack whatever you need. We can come back for anything else tomorrow." Hannah nodded slowly, her mind racing. It wasn't what she'd ever imagined for herself, but it was work, honest work, and it would keep a roof over her head. "Give me 15 minutes, she said, straightening her shoulders. Blake nodded, replacing his hat. "I'll wait." Inside the house, Hannah moved quickly, packing her few remaining possessions into a small carpet bag. Her dresses simple, practical garments she'd sewn herself, her mother's silver-backed hairbrush, a Bible, and the daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. Everything that defined her life fit into one small bag. When she emerged from the house, Blake was waiting patiently, having watered his horse at the trough. Without a word, he took her bag and secured it to his saddle, then offered his hand to help her mount. "I'll ride behind you," he said. Hannah had ridden astride all her life on the ranch, but never with anyone else. She hesitated only briefly before placing her foot in the stirrup and swinging herself up. Blake mounted behind her, his chest a solid presence against her back as he reached around her for the reins. She was acutely aware of his nearness, of the strength in his arms as he guided the horse toward the road that would take them to the Double Z Ranch. As they crested the hill, Hannah allowed herself one last look at the Miller Ranch, the only home she'd ever known. Then she turned her face forward, toward an uncertain future and the steady heartbeat of the man who had offered her a chance when she needed it most. The Double Z Ranch sprawled across 500 acres of prime grazing land, nestled in a valley with a year-round creek providing the precious water that had saved Blake's cattle during the drought years. As they rode through the main gate, Hannah took in the stark contrast between this prosperous operation and her family's failing ranch. The fences were sturdy and well-maintained, the barn freshly painted, and in the distance, she could see healthy cattle grazing on green pasture. The main house was a 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. It wasn't ostentatious, but it spoke of solid prosperity and careful management. Blake dismounted first, then reached up to help Hannah down. His hands at her waist were impersonal and gone the moment her feet touched the ground, but she felt the warmth of them even after he'd stepped away. "Come inside," he said, retrieving her bag from the saddle. "I'll show you where you'll be staying." The interior of the house was surprisingly comfortable, with solid, well-crafted furniture and colorful woven rugs covering the wooden floors. It was clean but had the slightly neglected air of a place without a woman's touch. Newspapers were stacked on the dining table, and a pair of muddy boots had been left by the door. "It's been just me and the ranch hands," Blake explained, seeming to read her assessment. "The men sleep in the bunkhouse, of course. You'll have the bedroom at the top of the stairs. It has its own washroom." He led her up the staircase to a pleasant room with a large window overlooking the ranch yard. The bed was made with simple but clean linens, and there was a dresser, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a small writing desk. "This was my mother's room," Blake said, setting her bag on the bed. "She passed 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Hannah said softly. Blake nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "Dinner is at 6. The men eat in the bunkhouse, but I take my meals here. You're welcome to join me, or you can eat separately if you prefer." "I'll join you," Hannah said. It seemed the proper thing to do, given that she was now his employee. "Good," Blake replied, and she thought she detected a hint of relief in his voice. "The kitchen is well stocked, but if there's anything you need, just let me know. I ride into town every Saturday." He showed her the rest of the house, the kitchen with its cast iron stove and well-organized pantry, the dining room, the study where he kept the ranch accounts, and the parlor they rarely used. Throughout the tour, he was polite but reserved, treating her more like a respected guest than a hired servant. "I have work to attend to," he said when they returned to the kitchen. "Make yourself at home. Dinner at 6. Then he was gone, leaving Hannah alone in the unfamiliar house. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, feeling oddly displaced, as if she'd stepped into someone else's life. Yesterday, she'd been the daughter of a rancher with a home and a family, however troubled. Today, she was a housekeeper, dependent on the goodwill of a man she barely knew. With a deep breath, she rolled up her sleeves and began to explore the kitchen more thoroughly, taking inventory and planning what to prepare for dinner. Work would give her purpose, would help keep the grief and uncertainty at bay, and perhaps, in time, she would find her footing in this new life. At precisely 6 o'clock, Hannah placed a hearty beef stew, fresh baked bread, and a bowl of stewed apples on the dining table. She'd cleared away the newspapers and set 2 places at one end of the large table. As she was lighting the lamps, Blake entered, his hair damp from washing up. "Something smells good," he said, his eyes taking in the prepared table with approval. "I hope you like stew," Hannah replied. There wasn't time for anything more elaborate. "Stew is fine. More than fine." He pulled out a chair for her before taking his own seat, a courtesy that surprised her. They ate in silence for several minutes before Blake spoke again. "The last woman who worked here, Mrs. Peterson, she'd been with my family since I was a boy. After she left, I realized I'd taken for granted how much she did around here." Hannah nodded. "Running a household is no small task." "No, it's not." He broke off a piece of bread. "This is good. Did you make it today?" "Yes. The dough was already rising when we arrived." Blake looked at her thoughtfully. "You didn't have to do that on your first day." Hannah met his gaze directly. "I'm not one to sit idle, Mr. Zimmerman. And I appreciate the opportunity you've given me. I intend to earn my keep." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Blake, if we're going to be living under the same roof, you should call me Blake." "Blake," Hannah repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on her tongue. "And I'm Hannah." They finished the meal with conversation about the ranch, how many men worked there, what the daily routines were, what would be expected of her. Blake was straightforward and practical, and by the time they'd finished the stewed apples, Hannah had a clear understanding of her new responsibilities. "I'll help with the dishes," Blake said as she began to clear the table. Hannah started to protest, but he was already carrying plates to the kitchen. "My mother taught me that those who don't help clean up don't deserve to eat," he explained. Side by side at the sink, they fell into an easy rhythm, Hannah washing, Blake drying and putting things away. It was strangely comfortable, this domestic task shared with a man who was still essentially a stranger. "Tomorrow I'll show you around the ranch," Blake said as he hung the dish towel to dry. "You should know where everything is if you're going to be living here." Hannah nodded, untying her apron. "I'd like that." Their eyes met briefly, and Hannah was struck by a sudden awareness of him not as her employer, but as a man. His broad shoulders, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he almost smiled. "Well, good night, Hannah," he said, breaking the moment. "Thank you for dinner." "Good night, Blake," she replied, watching as he left the kitchen, his footsteps fading down the hallway toward his study. Hannah climbed the stairs to her new room, feeling the weight of the day's events settling over her like a heavy blanket. She unpacked her few belongings, placing her parents' photograph on the bedside table and her Bible beside it. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to fall. She cried for her father, for the home she'd lost, for the uncertainty of her future. But when the tears finally subsided, Hannah found herself feeling strangely lighter. She was alive. She had work and shelter. And perhaps, in time, she would find her way forward from this unexpected turning point in her life. The following week settled into a rhythm that gradually began to feel almost normal to Hannah. She rose early each morning to prepare breakfast for Blake before he headed out to work with the ranch hands. The days were filled with cooking, cleaning, laundry, and organizing the house to her satisfaction. In the evenings, she and Blake would share dinner, their conversations growing less stilted and more natural as the days passed. On her third day at the Double Z, Blake had shown her the ranch's account books, explaining that he'd appreciate her help in keeping them orderly. Hannah had discovered she had a natural aptitude for numbers and record keeping, and soon she was spending an hour or two each afternoon in the study, recording expenses and income with meticulous care. It was during one of these accounting sessions, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, that Hannah discovered the truth about her situation. Blake had ridden into Julian that morning to meet with the banker, leaving Hannah alone with the account books. As she reviewed the recent entries, a notation caught her eye: a payment to the bank of Julian for Miller property acquisition. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the entry dated just 3 days after her father's funeral. Blake had purchased her family's ranch from the bank, which meant he had known about her situation before he ever rode up to offer her employment. When Blake returned that afternoon, Hannah was waiting for him in the study, the account book open on the desk before her. "You bought my father's ranch," she said without preamble as he entered the room. Blake stopped in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "I did. Before you came to offer me a job." He nodded once, removing his hat and placing it on the rack by the door. "Yes." Hannah's emotions were a tumultuous mix of confusion, anger, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. "Why didn't you tell me?" Blake crossed the room to stand before the desk, his gaze direct and unflinching. "Would you have accepted my offer if you'd known?" Hannah considered the question honestly. "Probably not. I would have seen it as charity, which is why I didn't tell you." Blake leaned against the desk, arms folded across his chest. "The fact is, Hannah, I did need help here. Mrs. Peterson leaving left a considerable gap in my household. But yes, I also knew that Thomas had abandoned you and that the bank was going to foreclose. I had been planning to expand my grazing land anyway, and your father's property adjoins mine. It made sense. And offering me employment, did that make sense too?" Hannah couldn't keep the edge from her voice. Something flickered in Blake's eyes: regret, perhaps, or discomfort at being challenged. "I respected your father. He was a good neighbor and a good man. The thought of his daughter being left destitute didn't sit right with me." "So it was charity," Hannah said flatly. "No." Blake's voice was firm. "It was offering a fair exchange: your skills for a wage and a place to stay. You've more than earned your keep these past 2 weeks, Hannah. You've transformed this house back into a home. You've organized my accounts better than they've been in years, and you've saved me countless hours of work. That's not charity, that's good business." Hannah wanted to be angry, to feel betrayed, but the practicality of his explanation was disarming. And beneath her wounded pride, she recognized the truth: Blake had offered her a dignified way forward when she'd had no options. "What do you intend to do with the Miller ranch?" she asked after a moment, her voice softer. "Fix it up. Use it for additional grazing. Maybe plant some of that land in hay." He paused, then added, "The house and your mother's garden, I'll leave those as they are for now." The consideration in that last statement touched something in Hannah. "Thank you," she said quietly. Blake straightened, his posture relaxing slightly as he sensed her anger dissipating. "You have every right to be upset that I didn't tell you, Hannah, but I hope you can understand my reasons." Hannah closed the account book, running her fingers along its leather binding. "I understand. But from now on, I'd appreciate complete honesty between us. I don't need to be protected from the truth." "Fair enough," Blake agreed. "Complete honesty." The tension in the room gradually eased, replaced by a new understanding between them. Hannah recognized that Blake's actions, though initially concealed from her, had come from a place of genuine concern and respect. And Blake seemed to recognize that Hannah was not someone to be managed or protected, but a woman of strength and dignity who deserved transparency. That evening at dinner, their conversation flowed more naturally than ever before, as if the afternoon's confrontation had cleared away an invisible barrier between them. Hannah found herself laughing at Blake's dry observations about the town gossips in Julian, and he seemed genuinely interested in her stories about growing up on the Miller ranch. "You never speak about your mother," Blake observed as they lingered over coffee after the meal. Hannah's smile faded slightly. "She died when I was 12, childbirth fever, the baby my brother was stillborn." "I'm sorry," Blake said, his voice gentle. "That must have been difficult." It was. Hannah traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. "My father was never the same afterward. He loved her very much." She hesitated, then added, "Thomas came later. My father married his mother about a year after we lost my mother. She was not kind. She died 3 years ago." Blake's eyes held genuine compassion. "And Thomas took after his mother rather than your father, I gather." "He did." Hannah sighed. "I tried to love him as a brother, but he never saw me as family, just an obligation his mother resented and he inherited." Blake reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his own, the first time he had deliberately touched her since helping her from his horse that first day. "Family is more than blood, Hannah. Sometimes the people who truly care for us aren't the ones we're born to." The warmth of his hand lingered on hers long after he withdrew it, and that night as Hannah prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about Blake Zimmerman in a way that had nothing to do with their employer-employee relationship. She wondered about his past, about why a man who was clearly prosperous and not unattractive remained unmarried at 30. She wondered if he ever felt the same loneliness that sometimes crept over her in the quiet hours. And she wondered, with a flutter in her stomach that both alarmed and excited her, what it might be like to be truly cared for by someone like Blake. The following Saturday dawned clear and cool, a welcome respite from the summer heat. Blake had mentioned at breakfast that he would be riding into Julian to purchase supplies and attend to some business, and he asked if Hannah would like to accompany him. "I could use some fabric for new curtains in the parlor," she said, trying to sound practical rather than eager for a break in her routine. "And perhaps some seeds for a kitchen garden." "Consider it done," Blake replied. "Be ready at 9. Hannah wore her best dress, a simple blue calico that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, and pinned her chestnut hair into a neat arrangement at the nape of her neck. It was the first time she'd be seen in public with Blake, and while she told herself it shouldn't matter what people thought, she was keenly aware that gossip traveled fast in a small town like Julian. Blake had hitched the wagon rather than saddling horses, and he helped Hannah up onto the seat with a courteous hand. The journey into town took just over an hour, and Hannah found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of conversation and the beautiful landscape rolling past. Julian was bustling with Saturday activity when they arrived. Blake tied the wagon in front of the general store and helped Hannah down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks as she noticed Mrs. Holloway, the minister's wife, watching them with undisguised interest from across the street. "I need to see the banker," Blake said. "Would you like to do your shopping, or shall we go together?" "I'll meet you at the general store when you're finished," Hannah replied. "Take your time." As soon as Blake departed, Hannah became acutely aware of the curious glances directed her way. Word of her situation and subsequent employment at the Double Z had clearly spread throughout Julian. She held her head high as she entered Grayson's general store, determined to conduct her business with dignity. Mr. Grayson, a jovial man with a magnificent mustache, greeted her warmly. "Miss Miller, good to see you. How are things out at the Zimmerman place?" "Very well, thank you," Hannah replied, examining a bolt of cheerful yellow fabric that would make perfect kitchen curtains. "Blake's a good man," Grayson said, measuring out the yards of fabric she requested. "Best rancher in these parts and fair in his dealings." "You could do worse for an employer." Hannah smiled politely, selecting some vegetable seeds from a display. "Yes, Mr. Zimmerman has been very kind." "Just Zimmerman now, is it?" came a familiar voice from behind her. "No longer the brother who abandoned you." Hannah turned slowly to face Thomas Miller, whose appearance had changed dramatically in the few weeks since she'd last seen him. His clothes were expensive but rumpled, his face flushed with what she suspected was whiskey, and his eyes held the hard gleam she remembered from their final confrontation. "Thomas," she acknowledged coolly, "I didn't know you were in town." "Just passing through," he replied, leaning against the counter with false casualness. "Heard you'd become Zimmerman's housekeeper. Or is it something more than that? Everyone's talking about how quickly he took you in." The insinuation in his tone made Hannah's cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Zimmerman offered me employment when I needed it, something my own brother failed to do." Thomas's face darkened. "You were always a burden, Hannah, to our father, to my mother, to me. Why should I have carried that weight any longer than I had to? Is there a problem here?" Blake's deep voice cut through the tension as he appeared beside Hannah, his expression thunderous as he took in the situation. "No problem," Thomas said, straightening. "Just catching up with my dear sister." Blake's hand came to rest protectively at the small of Hannah's back. "Miss Miller, are you ready to go? I've finished my business." Hannah nodded, grateful for his timely appearance. Mr. Grayson quickly wrapped her purchases, casting anxious glances between the three of them. As they turned to leave, Thomas called after them. "Enjoy playing house with my sister, Zimmerman. Just remember she comes with more baggage than she's worth." Blake froze, his body tensing as if he might turn back and confront Thomas. Hannah placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Please," she murmured. "He's not worth it." After a moment, Blake nodded, his jaw still clenched tight as he escorted Hannah from the store. Outside, he helped her into the wagon without a word, his movements controlled but radiating anger. They were halfway out of town before he spoke. "I apologize you had to endure that." "It's not your fault," Hannah said, smoothing her skirts. "Thomas has always been difficult." "He had no right to speak to you that way," Blake said, his knuckles white on the reins. "Or to imply what he did about your position in my household." Hannah felt a rush of warmth at his indignation on her behalf. "People will talk no matter what we do," she said softly. "The important thing is that we know the truth." Blake glanced at her, his expression softening. "You're a remarkable woman, Hannah Miller. Most people would be crushed by what you've endured these past weeks, but you face it all with such dignity." The simple compliment meant more to Hannah than any flowery praise ever could have. "Thank you," she said, unable to find more eloquent words. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the tension gradually easing from Blake's shoulders. As they passed the turnoff to what had been the Miller Ranch, Hannah found herself wondering aloud, "Do you think we could stop there? Just for a moment? I left in such a hurry, and there are a few things I'd like to collect if they're still there." Blake immediately guided the wagon down the familiar dirt road. "Of course. I should have offered before now." The ranch looked much the same as when Hannah had left it, though she noted with a pang that the small vegetable garden she'd tended was now overgrown with weeds. Blake helped her down from the wagon, then followed her to the house, standing back respectfully as she opened the door. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight streaming through the windows. Hannah moved through the rooms with a strange sense of detachment, as if she were visiting a museum of her former life rather than a home. In her parents' bedroom, she found her mother's quilt still folded at the foot of the bed. In the kitchen, her mother's recipes were tucked in a tin box on a shelf. As she gathered these treasures and a few other mementos, Blake waited patiently, saying little but offering his help when needed. It wasn't until they were about to leave that Hannah paused in the doorway of her childhood home and felt the first real wave of grief hit her, not for the house itself, but for the family that had once filled it with life. Blake must have seen the change in her expression because he stepped closer, his voice gentle. "Are you all right?" Hannah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. To her surprise, Blake reached out and drew her into his arms, holding her in a comforting embrace that asked nothing of her but offered everything she needed in that moment's: strength, understanding, and a safe harbor for her grief. She allowed herself to lean into his solid warmth, her cheek against the rough fabric of his shirt, listening to the steady beat of his heart. His hand moved in soothing circles on her back, and gradually, the sharp edge of her sadness dulled to a manageable ache. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. Blake's arms tightened briefly before he released her, his eyes searching her face with concern. "Better," Hannah nodded, feeling strangely shy now that the moment of vulnerability had passed. "Yes, I'm ready to go. Home." The words slipped out naturally, and Hannah realized with a start that she had come to think of the Double Z as home in the short time she'd been there. Blake seemed to understand the significance of her choice of words, his expression warming as he helped her carry her treasures to the wagon. As they drove away from the Miller ranch, Hannah didn't look back. Her gaze was fixed forward, toward the future that was unfolding before her, a future that, increasingly, she hoped might include the quiet, steadfast man beside her. The summer days lengthened into a golden rhythm of work and companionship. Hannah settled more deeply into her role at the Double Z, expanding her responsibilities to include overseeing the preservation of the harvest from the kitchen garden she'd planted. The ranch hands, initially wary of having a woman in their midst, had come to appreciate her cooking and the way she'd made the main house feel like a home. Blake, too, had changed over the weeks. The reserved employer had gradually given way to a man who smiled more readily, who lingered over evening meals to talk, and who sometimes joined Hannah on the porch after dinner to watch the sunset paint the hills in shades of amber and rose. It was on one such evening in late August that Blake broke their comfortable silence with a question. "Do you miss it? Your old life?" Hannah considered the question, her hands busy with the mending in her lap. "I miss my father, and the simplicity of knowing exactly where I belonged." She paused, needle poised mid-stitch. "But there are things I don't miss. The constant worry about money, Thomas's resentment, the loneliness." "You were lonely there?" Blake asked, surprise evident in his voice. Hannah nodded. "After my father's health began to fail, he withdrew into himself." "And Thomas?" "Well, we were never close. I had acquaintances in town, of course, but no true friends." She glanced at him, a small smile touching her lips. "I'm less lonely here, despite being farther from town." Blake's eyes held hers for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. "I'm glad," he said simply. As September arrived with its cooler nights and hints of autumn, Hannah noticed a subtle shift in her relationship with Blake. There was a new awareness between them, a current of something deeper than friendship or the respect between employer and employee. It manifested in the way Blake's hand would brush against hers when passing the salt at dinner, in the way his eyes would seek her out when he returned from working on the range, in the way conversation between them flowed with increasing ease and intimacy. One crisp morning, Hannah was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when Blake entered unexpectedly, his expression unusually serious. "Hannah, I need to speak with you," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "Of course," she replied, wiping flour from her hands. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong." Blake paced the length of the kitchen before facing her directly. "I've been offered an opportunity to purchase a herd of prime breeding cattle from a rancher near Sacramento. It would be a significant investment for the ranch, but one that could pay dividends for years to come." "That sounds promising," Hannah said, wondering why this business matter required such gravity. "It would require me to travel to Sacramento," Blake continued. "I'd be gone for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. "Oh." Hannah was surprised by the immediate sense of loss she felt at the prospect of his absence. "When would you leave?" "Tomorrow, if I decide to go." Blake watched her face carefully. "The ranch hands know their duties and Rodriguez can oversee the day-to-day operations, but I wanted to make sure you'd be comfortable staying here alone for that length of time." Hannah straightened her shoulders. "Of course, I'll be perfectly fine. The ranch is my home now, after all." Something flickered in Blake's eyes at her words, pleasure, perhaps, or relief. "Yes, it is," he said quietly. There was a moment of charged silence between them, filled with things neither was quite ready to say aloud. "You should go," Hannah said finally. "It's a good opportunity for the ranch." Blake nodded, though he seemed oddly reluctant now that she'd agreed. "I'll make arrangements then. Rodriguez will check on you daily, and Mrs. Turner from town has agreed to stay a few nights if you'd prefer not to be alone in the house." "That won't be necessary," Hannah assured him. "I've never been afraid of solitude." The next morning dawned gray and misty as Hannah prepared a hearty breakfast for Blake's journey. They ate mostly in silence, the impending separation casting a shadow over their usual comfortable conversation. As Blake rose to leave, gathering his packed saddlebags from beside the door, Hannah felt a sudden, irrational urge to ask him to stay. Instead, she handed him a package wrapped in waxed paper. "Food for the journey," she explained. "The biscuits should stay fresh for at least 2 days." Blake accepted the package, his fingers brushing hers in a touch that lingered. "Thank you, Hannah, for everything." "Safe travels," she replied, forcing a cheerful tone. "The ranch and I will be waiting when you return." He hesitated, looking as if he wanted to say something more, but ultimately just nodded and placed his hat on his head. At the door, he turned back one last time. "Take care of yourself, Hannah. And you," she said softly. Then he was gone, and Hannah was left with the strange emptiness of the house around her, and the hollow feeling in her chest that she wasn't quite ready to name. The first few days of Blake's absence passed slowly, with Hannah throwing herself into work to keep loneliness at bay. She thoroughly cleaned every room in the house, preserved the last of the summer vegetables, and even helped Rodriguez with the ranch accounts, though Blake had left them in perfect order. On the 4th day, a late-season thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, bringing driving rain and spectacular lightning that illuminated the night sky in brilliant flashes. Hannah sat by the window in the parlor, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching nature's display and thinking of Blake, wondering if he was caught in the same storm or if he'd reached Sacramento safely. A particularly loud crack of thunder made her jump, and as the sound faded, she heard another noise, a pounding at the front door. Alarmed, Hannah grabbed the lamp and moved cautiously to the entryway. The ranch hands all had access to the bunkhouse, No one should be seeking shelter at the main house at this hour. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Open the door, Hannah," came a slurred, angry voice she recognized immediately. "Thomas." Hannah hesitated, her hand on the latch. "What do you want, Thomas? It's late." "I want what's mine," he shouted over another roll of thunder. "Open this door or I'll break it down." With reluctance, Hannah opened the door a few inches, keeping the chain engaged. Rain lashed in through the gap, and she could see Thomas swaying on the porch, drenched and clearly intoxicated. "Nothing here is yours," she said firmly. "Go away, Thomas. You're drunk." Thomas's face contorted with rage. "This should have been mine, all of it. If our father hadn't been so besotted with your precious mother, if he hadn't wasted everything trying to save her, we wouldn't have lost everything." "You didn't lose everything," Hannah countered, anger rising to match his. "You took what was valuable and left me with nothing. Now go before I call the ranch hands." Thomas laughed, a bitter sound that raised the hairs on the back of Hannah's neck. "The bunkhouse is dark. They're all in town for that dance at the saloon. It's just you and me, sister dear." Hannah's blood ran cold at the realization that he was right. Rodriguez had mentioned the dance, and she'd encouraged the men to go, assuring them she'd be fine alone. Now she was isolated with a drunk, angry man who clearly harbored deep resentments. "I'm giving you one chance to leave peacefully," she said, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Thomas's response was to throw his weight against the door, splintering the chain and sending Hannah stumbling backward. She dropped the lamp, which thankfully went out rather than breaking and starting a fire. In the darkness, illuminated only by flashes of lightning, Thomas advanced on her. "I came back for Father's watch," he snarled. "The gold one, worth a small fortune. Where is it?" "I don't have it," Hannah said, backing away toward the kitchen where she knew a rifle was kept. "You took it when you left, along with Mother's silver and Father's horse." Thomas lunged for her, grabbing her arm with painful force. "You're lying. I need that watch." Hannah twisted free, fear giving her strength. "You're in debt again, aren't you? Gambling. That's why you need money so desperately." A flash of lightning revealed the truth in Thomas's expression, desperation mixed with a cornered animal's fear. "Some men in San Francisco don't take kindly to delays in payment," he admitted. "I need that watch, Hannah, or something of equal value." "There's nothing here for you," Hannah insisted, continuing to back away. "Blake took everything valuable with him for safekeeping while he's away." It was a lie, but one Thomas might believe in his intoxicated state. She was nearly to the kitchen door now, just a few more steps. "Blake, is it?" Thomas sneered. "On a first-name basis with your employer. Does he warm your bed too, Hannah? Is that how you earned your keep?" Hannah's hand found the door frame, and she used it to steady herself as she fixed Thomas with a contemptuous glare. "You're pathetic. Get out of this house before I get the rifle and make you leave." Something in her voice, the steel beneath the fear, perhaps seemed to penetrate Thomas's drunken haze. He swayed, looking suddenly uncertain. "You always thought you were better than me," he said, but the venom had leached from his voice, leaving only a petulant whine. "Father's favorite. The good child, while I was just the unwanted reminder of his second mistake." For the first time, Hannah felt a flicker of pity for her half-brother. "Father loved you, Thomas. He just didn't know how to show it after Mother died." Thomas shook his head, backing toward the door. "Too late for that now, isn't it? For all of us." He paused at the threshold, rain still pouring down outside. "I won't be back, Hannah. There's nothing for me here anymore." Then he was gone, stumbling into the storm and leaving Hannah trembling in the dark house, the echo of the confrontation hanging in the air like the lingering scent of whiskey and regret. She didn't sleep that night, keeping the rifle across her lap as she sat in the kitchen, jumping at every noise until dawn finally broke and the storm cleared. When Rodriguez arrived to check on her, she told him about Thomas's intrusion, and the foreman immediately posted a man at the house for the remainder of Blake's absence, despite Hannah's protests that it wasn't necessary. The incident cast a shadow over the following days, leaving Hannah with a lingering sense of unease. Thomas's accusations about her relationship with Blake had struck a nerve, not because there was truth to his insinuations, but because they highlighted the ambiguous nature of her position in Blake's household. Was she merely an employee, a friend? Or was there something more developing between them, something Hannah was increasingly unable to deny in the privacy of her own heart? These questions occupied her thoughts as the days of Blake's absence stretched into a second week, then a third. A letter arrived from Sacramento, explaining that negotiations were taking longer than expected, but that he hoped to conclude business soon and return home. Hannah read and reread the brief message, finding comfort in Blake's formal but warm closing. "The ranch is not the same without you. Take care until I return." It was nearly a month after his departure when Hannah, hanging laundry in the yard on a crisp October morning, heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She shaded her eyes against the sun, her heart leaping at the sight of a familiar figure on horseback cresting the hill. Blake had returned. Hannah wanted to run to meet him, to show the joy she felt at his return, but propriety held her in check. Instead, she continued hanging the sheets, though her hands trembled slightly as she pinned them to the line. Blake dismounted near the barn, speaking briefly with Rodriguez before turning toward the house. When he saw Hannah in the yard, he changed direction, coming directly to her, his stride purposeful and his expression impossible to read at this distance. "Welcome home," Hannah said as he approached, her voice steadier than she'd expected. Blake stopped a few feet away, his eyes taking in every detail of her face as if committing it to memory. "It's good to be home," he replied, and something in the way he said home made Hannah's heart beat faster. "Was your trip successful?" she asked, smoothing her apron nervously. "Very." Blake took a step closer. "I secured the breeding stock at a fair price, and I've arranged for them to be delivered next month." He paused, then added, "Rodriguez told me about Thomas." Hannah sighed, pinning the last sheet to the line. "It was nothing to worry about. He was drunk and desperate for money." "He threatened you," Blake said, his voice hardening. "In my house." "Our house," Hannah corrected without thinking, then flushed at her presumption. "I mean our house," Blake repeated softly, closing the distance between them. "Hannah, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been thinking about for the entire journey home." Hannah's breath caught at the intensity in his eyes. "Yes." Blake took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. "When I was in Sacramento, I was offered another opportunity, a partnership in a large cattle operation that would require me to relocate to California's Central Valley. It would mean more money, less risk, a chance to expand beyond what I could achieve here." Hannah's heart sank. He was leaving. After all this time, after all they'd shared, he was going to leave her just as everyone else had. "I turned it down," Blake continued, watching her face carefully, "because I realized that success means nothing if I couldn't share it with you, because this ranch isn't home without you in it." Hannah stared at him, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. "Blake, I've been alone for a long time," he went on, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought it was enough, the ranch, the work, the respect of my peers. But then you came into my life, Hannah, with your courage and your dignity and your quiet strength, and you showed me what I'd been missing. You made this house a home again." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small, worn velvet box. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "I've carried it with me since she died, waiting for the right woman to give it to." Hannah's eyes filled with tears as Blake dropped to one knee before her, heedless of the dirt and the laundry basket and Rodriguez watching from the barn with a broad grin. "Hannah Miller, I love you," Blake said, his voice clear and certain. "Will you marry me? Not as my housekeeper, but as my wife, my partner, the other half of my heart." For a moment, Hannah couldn't speak past the emotion clogging her throat. All the loneliness of her past, all the uncertainty of her future, crystallized into this perfect moment of clarity and joy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Blake Zimmerman, I will marry you." Blake slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to his feet, gathering her into his arms with a look of such tender happiness that Hannah felt her heart might burst. When his lips met hers in their first kiss, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the arms of the man who had seen her at her lowest moment and said, simply, "Stay with me." Their wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Julian, with the entire town turning out to witness the union of Blake Zimmerman and Hannah Miller. The October day was perfect, crisp and clear, with leaves turning gold and crimson on the hills surrounding the valley. Hannah wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Turner and the other women of Julian had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once adorned her mother's wedding gown. Blake, standing tall and proud at the altar in a new black suit, watched her walk down the aisle with such naked adoration that several of the townswomen dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The celebration afterward at the Double Z Ranch lasted well into the night, with tables set up in the yard, lanterns hanging from tree branches, and a local band playing while couples danced on a wooden platform Blake's men had constructed for the occasion. Hannah, moving among their guests with Blake's hand warm at the small of her back, felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. As the last guests departed and the ranch hands discreetly withdrew to the bunkhouse, Blake led Hannah toward the main house, their house, where a new chapter of their life together would begin. "Are you happy, Mrs. Zimmerman?" he asked, pausing on the porch to draw her into his arms. Hannah looked up at him, at the face that had become as dear and necessary to her as breathing. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. Blake's kiss was tender and promising, a prelude to the intimacy they would soon share. "Welcome home," he whispered against her lips. "I've been home since the day you said, 'Stay with me,'" Hannah replied, her heart overflowing with love for this man who had seen her value when she'd lost sight of it herself. Blake lifted her into his arms then, carrying her over the threshold into their home, and their future, a future built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and a love that had blossomed in the most unexpected of circumstances. 5 years later, 1881, the spring morning dawned clear and bright over the Double Z Ranch, now one of the most prosperous cattle operations in San Diego County. Hannah stood on the porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands as she surveyed the domain she and Blake had built together. The ranch had expanded considerably in the 5 years since their marriage, incorporating not only her father's former property but additional grazing lands to the north. The main house, too, had grown, with a new wing added to accommodate their growing family. At the sound of childish laughter, Hannah turned to see Blake emerging from the barn, their 3-year-old son Samuel perched on his shoulders and their 18-month-old daughter Eliza toddling determinedly at his side, her small hand clutching his pant leg for balance. "Mama," Samuel called, waving frantically. "Papa showed me the new calf," Hannah smiled, setting down her coffee cup to receive her excited son as Blake lifted him from his shoulders. "Did he now?" And was it as big as you? Samuel's eyes widened. Bigger, much bigger. Blake scooped up Eliza, who was making grabby hands toward her mother. He's exaggerating slightly, he said with a wink. The calf is perhaps the size of a large dog. Hannah accepted her daughter into her arms, pressing a kiss to the child's soft cheek. And how is Clover doing? Mother and calf are both healthy, Blake reported, leaning in to steal a quick kiss from his wife. Rodriguez says it's the finest heifer born this season. Hannah shifted Eliza to her hip, reaching out to smooth Samuel's tousled hair. Well, that calls for a celebration. How about flapjacks for breakfast? This announcement was met with enthusiastic approval from Samuel, who immediately began tugging his father toward the kitchen. Blake laughed, allowing himself to be pulled along, though he paused to wrap an arm around Hannah's waist, drawing her and Eliza into a brief family embrace. "I love you," he murmured against her temple. "And I love you," Hannah replied, the words as fresh and true as the first time she'd spoken them. Inside, the kitchen was warm and filled with morning light. Maria, the young woman who now helped with the housekeeping and childcare, was already at the stove, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. She greeted the family with a smile, immediately taking Eliza from Hannah to settle the toddler in her high chair with a piece of bread to gnaw on. As Hannah mixed the flapjack batter, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of domestic contentment. From the desperate young woman abandoned by her kin to the confident wife and mother she was now, every step had been shaped by the man who now sat at the table, patiently helping Samuel place silverware in the proper positions. Their marriage had not been without challenges. The first year had brought a severe drought that threatened the new breeding stock Blake had invested in. The second year, Hannah had lost a baby early in her pregnancy, a grief that had tested them both. But through it all, they had faced each trial together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. Now, with 2 healthy children, a thriving ranch, and the deep, abiding love they shared, Hannah knew that the hardships of her early life had led her to exactly where she was meant to be. As if sensing her thoughts, Blake looked up from his task with Samuel, his eyes finding hers across the kitchen. The connection between them was tangible, a silent communication born of years of shared experiences and mutual understanding. "What are you thinking about so seriously this morning?" he asked as she brought the first stack of flapjacks to the table. Hannah smiled, running a hand affectionately over his shoulder as she passed. "Just how fortunate I am, how fortunate we all are." Blake caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Fortune had little to do with it, my love. We built this life together, choice by choice, day by day." Samuel, impatient with the adult conversation, bounced in his seat. "Flapjacks, Mama, please." Laughing, Hannah served her son, then her husband, before settling into her own chair with Eliza now clamoring to sit in her lap. The simple family breakfast was, to Hannah, the purest form of happiness, surrounded by the love she had once feared she would never find. Later that morning, while the children napped and Blake worked in the study on the ranch accounts, a task he still insisted on handling personally, despite Hannah's aptitude for numbers, a rider approached the house. Hannah, pinning laundry to the line, recognized Sheriff Davis from Julian. "Good morning, Sheriff," she called, setting down her basket to greet him. "What brings you out to the Double Z?" Davis dismounted, removing his hat respectfully. "Morning, Mrs. Zimmerman. Is your husband available? I've got some news I think he'd want to hear." Hannah led the sheriff into the house, offering him coffee while she fetched Blake from the study. The 2 men greeted each other with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "What brings you out this way, John?" Blake asked, gesturing for Davis to take a seat at the kitchen table. Davis accepted the coffee Hannah poured, taking a thoughtful sip before answering. Got a wire from the sheriff up in San Francisco yesterday. Thought you should know Thomas Miller was found dead in an alley behind a gambling house. Knife wound to the chest. Hannah sank slowly into a chair, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. Thomas had not attempted to contact her since that stormy night 5 years ago, but she had occasionally heard rumors of his whereabouts and increasingly desperate circumstances. Do they know who did it? Blake asked, his hand finding Hannah's shoulder in silent support. Davis shook his head. No suspects. Likely a dispute over gambling debts from what the San Francisco sheriff wrote. They found your address in his pocket, looks like an old letter, which is why they notified us. Is there anything we need to do? Hannah asked quietly. Arrangements to be made. He's already been buried in a pauper's grave, Davis said, his voice gentle. I'm sorry to bring such news, Mrs. Zimmerman, but I thought you should hear it officially rather than through gossip. Hannah nodded, grateful for the sheriff's consideration. Thank you for telling us. After Davis had departed, Blake found Hannah in the garden, kneeling among the herbs she cultivated for both culinary and medicinal purposes. He lowered himself beside her, not speaking, simply offering his presence as she processed the news. I keep thinking about what might have been different, Hannah said after a long silence. If my father had been able to connect with him, if his mother had been kinder, if I had somehow found a way to reach him. Blake took her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. Some people can't be reached, Hannah. Thomas made his choices just as you made yours. I know. Hannah looked up at the blue expanse of sky, at the rolling hills of the ranch, at the home she and Blake had created. It just seems such a waste of a life. Blake nodded, understanding her grief not for the man Thomas had become, but for the brother he might have been. Would you like to do something to remember him? Perhaps plant a tree, the suggestion, so typical of Blake's practical but thoughtful nature, brought a small smile to Hannah's lips. I think I'd like that, not for the man he was at the end, but for the boy he was before bitterness consumed him. That evening, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Blake and Hannah sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Hannah's head rested on Blake's shoulder, his arm around her waist, the rhythmic creaking of the swing the only sound in the peaceful night. I've been thinking, Blake said, breaking the comfortable silence, about expanding the house again. Hannah lifted her head to look at him. Again. What did you have in mind? A proper library, Blake replied. With floor-to-ceiling shelves and comfortable chairs. Samuel is already showing an interest in books, and Eliza will too before we know it. The thought of a room dedicated to books, a luxury Hannah had never dreamed of in her childhood, warmed her heart. That sounds wonderful. Where would you build it? Off the study, I thought. And speaking of children. Blake turned to face her more directly, his expression tender in the dim light from the parlor windows. I was hoping we might need another bedroom before too long. Hannah's hand went instinctively to her stomach, where the first fluttering signs of new life had made themselves known just days ago. She'd been waiting for the right moment to share the news. Blake Zimmerman, she said, her voice trembling with joy. Are you saying you want another child? Blake's smile was slow and full of wonder as understanding dawned. Hannah Miller Zimmerman, are you saying we're already expecting one? Hannah nodded, tears of happiness filling her eyes. In about 7 months, if my calculations are correct. Blake gathered her close, his kiss conveying all the love and gratitude words could never fully express. When they finally parted, he pressed his forehead to hers, his hands cradling her face as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Every day, he whispered, I thank God that I rode up to your ranch that day. that I found the courage to ask you to stay with me." Hannah smiled, remembering the desperate young woman she had been, standing in the dust watching her brother abandon her. How far she had come from that moment of desolation to this life of abundance. "And every day," she replied, "I thank God that I said yes." Above them, the stars continued their ageless dance across the heavens, bearing witness to a love that had begun with a simple offer of shelter and work, and had grown into a legacy that would endure for generations to come on the rolling hills of the Double Z Ranch.